Good morning. Sorry about the delay. Dr. Davis was in one Marriott hotel and Dr. Schwartz was in another picking him up, so you can imagine it didn't work very well, so here we are. Sorry about it. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our visiting speaker, Dr. Jonathan Davis. Dr. Davis is the Vice Chair of Pediatrics, Chief of Newborn Medicine, and the Associate Director of the Clinical and Translational Science Institute at the Floating Hospital for Children at Tufts Medical Center. He's also, of course, a Professor of Pediatrics at Tufts University School of Medicine. His research is very extensive and has been focused on neonatal drug development, which is, as all of us know, very difficult to do for the prevention and treatment of a variety of neonatal conditions. He's authored over 200 manuscripts and chapters, has been speaking extensively both nationally and internationally, and he has received numerous grants and awards from the NIH, FDA, March of Dimes, and many other private foundations. He's currently funded by the NIH and the FDA, and his research is focused on developing better outcome measures for clinical trials and new and existing therapeutics to improve neonatal outcome. Dr. Davis is chair of the Neonatal Advisory Committee in the Office of the Commissioner at the FDA, the director of the International Neonatal Consortium, and a member of Leadership Council of the American Pediatric Society. These positions permit him to work closely with governments, academic leaders, industry, and families to promote the development of important therapeutics for infants and children. Dr. Davis and I met on several occasions. I served on one of the advisory committees or councils at the FDA, and as a special emphasis, or you called it special government employee, we got to know each other, but really got to know each other much better working together with Dr. Lena Sun at Columbia University, where she's conducting this both retro and prospective clinical trial called PANDA. As you know, a big issue that's kind of glooming upon us is potential neurotoxic effects of anesthetics on the developing brain with long-lasting impact on children's development. So I've been talking to Dr. Davis quite a bit, actually trying to understand the FDA side of the whole process, as well as trying to discuss different therapeutic options that we may want to consider as time goes on. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jonathan Davis.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll try to go a little bit quicker to get you out to where you need to go. Let's try that. No conflict of interest, unfortunately, to disclose. So people ask me what the Floating Hospital for Children is, so I thought I'd actually show you. It was a ship in Boston Harbor in the 1800s, and this is what it looked like. This was one of the inpatient wards that they had, a little bit crowded. I talked to my nurses to see if they would put those little hats on again, and they don't like that idea. But you can see it was a very busy place. And this is one of my favorite pictures from the archives. So these, you can see some of the femurs are bowed. So these are kids with rickets that they used to run around the top deck in the sun. Obviously, you couldn't do that now anymore. They'd get all burned. But this was before they put vitamin D in milk. So this is how they got their extra vitamin D. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work. And I'm not sure. Let me just see. Nope. I'm going to skip through that. And let's just talk about newborn intensive care. And I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done in neonates, although it applies to children in general. But 6% of the approximately 4 million births each year in the U.S. require a NICU admission. You'll be fascinated to hear that the United States has the highest rates of premature delivery of any developed country in the world, where no one else is even close to us. We don't completely understand why that's the case. We spend well over $29 billion a year related to prematurity, and yet there's only been marginal improvements in both survival and outcomes really over the last 20 years. And when we look at the drugs we use in the NICU to treat our patients, and really even the drugs you're using to put these babies to sleep when you get them in the OR, over 90% of them have never been FDA approved for those indications, which means there's never been adequate safety and efficacy study to support the use of the drugs we're using on a routine basis. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So why has drug development been so difficult for neonates? So the last treatment that was FDA approved that made a significant impact on survival and outcome in neonates was 1991, pulmonary surfactant. I helped develop it 27 years ago. That was the last drug getting FDA approval. So why has everybody avoided this population? We call them therapeutic orphans sometime. And you can really also talk about pregnant women in the same way, and you certainly have to operate on these mothers sometimes while they're pregnant. It's a small market, so there's not a lot of money, rare diseases, and it's high risk and high liability. There's very few appropriate animal models, especially for premature infants, that simulate exactly what happens. Difficulty with study design and outcome measures that we'll talk about, and you may need to wait to figure out whether the treatments you're working on make a difference. So how long do you have to wait? So if you're treating a baby with a drug in the NICU, we say, well, do we wait till they go home and that's a success? Do we wait until they turn about 2 so we can do a Bailey exam and look at their neurodevelopmental outcome? Other people say, well, you really should wait till 5 years of age, until they're in school and you can start looking at their behavior and their vision. Other people say, well, shouldn't you wait later till they're in high school or college? So how long do you want a company to wait to decide whether their drug is safe and efficacious? And the smallest neonates may be exposed to up to 60 drugs while they're in the NICU. So then you're trying to decide also on various drug-drug interactions. So here's the drug development paradigm, and this is from Susie McCune, who's the director of the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics at FDA. We need the right drug, right population, the right dose, the right trial design, and the right endpoints. Sounds easy, right? It isn't, and that's been part of the problem for all of us. So a lot of the drug development, both for infants and children, is being driven by legislation. So don't let anyone think that all of a sudden the companies have gotten very altruistic and decided that we need to really study these different drugs in children. And so you can see on the left, it really started in the 70s and 80s. And if you get down into where you see US FDAMA, which is the carrot. So we offered companies an extra 6 months of patent protection if they will study a drug in children. So that is part of what we call the Best Pharmaceutical for Children's Act, which you can see, that's the carrot. That's important because a company like Pfizer that's making Viagra, sildenafil, I mean, they're making $1 billion a year on that drug. And so if they spend $10 or $20 million on a children's study and they can get an extra 6 months of patent protection, that starts to make sense. The EU regulations kicked in the about 2005, both the carrot and stick. So they gave them the extra patent protection, but they mandated that after every phase 1 trial, if you're doing any drug development for adults, you have to have a pediatric plan. And we passed that legislation here in 2012, FDASIA, a law that I was involved in passing, which said that we'll give you the extra patent protection, but any drug you're developing for adults at the end of phase 2, you have to have both a pediatric and a neonatal plan. So that is what's driving all the interest and driving all the drug development now for not only neonates but children in general. So it's not even just pediatric studies, because at the FDA we've looked, and out of 406 medicines studied in children in response to these laws, and to get the 6 months of exclusivity, only 28 of them were studied in neonates. And we don't use any of them on a routine basis, maybe once in a while. So that's the problem, is that the drugs that we're using on a routine basis in the NICU, many of them are off-label, and so there's really no incentives for any company to want to study them. And you're probably seeing something like that in the operating room as well. Having trained at Boston Children's and CHOP and been at a variety of places, I've worked with some great anesthesiologists. I would have loved to have done anesthesia, but I didn't like getting up that early. And so, ultimately, I have never met anyone who puts a baby to sleep the same way. And so part of the issue, as we'll talk about it, is some of the standards and how do we develop best practices and standardized approaches. So there's been a lot of issues in neonatology over the years that have had good intentions that have gone wrong. So for 20 years, I used dexamethasone routinely. You've used it for airway edema after prolonged intubation, etc. But we also used it for acute and chronic lung disease because it was really good at improving lung mechanics and reducing the amount of oxygen babies required, getting them off the ventilator. And it took about 20 years before someone actually did a randomized controlled trial, finding that those kids had, at a year of age, smaller heads, more cerebral palsy, and higher mortality rates. Overnight, we stopped using it. And we still use it to this day, but at much lower doses, much shorter courses, and people are much more cautious. How about blood pressure in preterm neonates? So when I go to the FDA, they say to me, blood pressure, that's important, isn't it? I say, yep. They say, don't they call that a vital sign? I say, yeah, that's true. They say, well, what's the normal blood pressure of a 500-gram infant? I say, I have no idea. So how is blood pressure measured? How do we validate those measurements? What's normal blood pressure? And many of you probably use what I have been exposed to and use. Well, is the blood pressure, the mean blood pressure, approximately the gestational age of the newborn? Well, a colleague of mine tried to track down where that came from. It took him 6 months. He found it was a nurse in rural England who went around to a few nurseries and made an observation, wrote something about it, and everyone adopted it, based on no data. So this is part of the issue. So if we don't know what normal blood pressure is, how do we know what hypotension is to develop trials? So I often say that hypotension is much like the Supreme Court discussion and decision on pornography. They say, I don't know what it is, how to define it, but I will know it when I see it. So we know when a baby looks bad, and often I tell the people I'm training not to pay as much attention to the number, but what's the baby's perfusion, what's their pH, what's their urine output, and look at physiologic indicators. But this is really one of the difficulties of something as basic as understanding blood pressure. And if you look from the Neonatal Research Network, these are all the different centers, and you can see in the open white bars is the use of dopamine for treatment of hypotension. The gray bars are mean blood pressure less than the gestational age, and then survival. And what you can easily see is there's absolutely no correlation. So there are some centers that have great survival, use almost no presses at all. We're one of those centers. And other centers that use lots of presses and have the exact same outcome. And no one's been able to show changes in neurodevelopmental outcome. So that's one of the issues that we're really dealing with. You heard Vesna talk about analgesia and anesthesia. She's been a very important player in the field talking about this, and as we've discussed more about the use of anesthetics and sedation for neonates, the No Pain trial was a small trial of 67 neonates randomized to get morphine or placebo, and the morphine seemed to reduce death. white matter injury, which is periventricular leukomalacia, severe interventricular hemorrhage, and we were delighted. We thought, great, we're going to start sedating a lot of these babies. There's been a lot of discussion, as you know, in the literature about pre-intubation use of both paralytics and fentanyl or morphine to try to sedate the babies. And so then we did a larger trial, of 898 infants, and not only did morphine not improve outcome, it actually increased injury and poor outcome in groups of infants at 27 to 29 weeks. So there's a lot of concern about anesthetics that was addressed previously, and you folks have been doing some excellent work about this that we're all quite concerned about it. The number one question that I get asked at the FDA or by parents or other people when they hear about this is, well, aren't you supposed to study this stuff before you start using it in babies and figure out whether there's a problem or not? Why have we been putting babies to sleep for 30 or 40 years, and now we're figuring that maybe some of these medications, either alone or in combinations, may potentially be harmful? I'm not convinced that they are yet, but it is something for us to think about. And your group has played a very important role in the Smart Tots program at FDA, which is a wonderful public-private partnership. It's one of the best that the FDA has, and we're all trying to do this together. And one of the concerns has been you anesthetize these babies and keep them sedated in the OR for maybe 4 or 5 hours. What are we doing to them when we're giving them multiple doses of these medications over weeks, or sometimes having babies post-op or very sick babies on a fentanyl drip for up to 2 or 3 weeks in the NICU? What does that do? And is it an issue when the babies have neurodevelopmental delays afterwards? We say, well, that's associated with prematurity. Is it? Or could it be associated with some of the medications that we're treating them with? And that's something that we have to think about. So how about pediatric formulations? So most of the drugs that you're using in babies and children, and we're using, are actually adult formulations because we don't have, quote, safe formulations for children. So there's really a lot of concerns about the formulations and we call them extrinsics, the stabilizers and preservatives that are in these medications. So for instance, methadone that we routinely treat babies with neonatal abstinence syndrome has about 15% alcohol in it. Your favorite wine is about 9%. So this is almost double. If you look at buprenorphine that we treat the babies with, 30% alcohol. So that's like giving them a shot of vodka. Phenobarbital. When I go to the FDA, they say, isn't that stuff you use to treat seizures and brain injury and things? I say, yes. Well, the oral elixir we have is 20 to 25% alcohol. So I had an idea once. I said, well, I'm not going to use that. I'll use the IV form, which we treat babies with acute seizures. Turns out that there's 60% propylene glycol in the adult formulation. So that's a close cousin to antifreeze that you use in your car. And it's a preservative. And 2 years ago, 2 or 3 babies in Europe died of propylene glycol toxicity. So this is the concern that we have, that maybe some of these adult formulations for babies may be causing complications that we don't understand. So for neonatal clinical trials, drugs and devices, the demand is increasing. The system can work, but the trials are very inefficient, take too long, and are much too expensive. Most trials fail due to inadequate enrollment. The infrastructure is fragmented and lacks sustainability. The expertise in the workforce is limited. So there really are opportunities for us to do a better job, and we really are starting to put things together. So if you look from industry at the bottom, the average drug, if you're developing it for children, takes 15 years from the start of the animal work to the clinical trials being completed. 30% of sites never enroll a single patient. 4 to 6 amendments for every protocol. Never mind the fact that the protocols they sometimes put together are terrible. And so I'll talk to you more about that. And the average program enrolls 1.5 patients per year. So clearly that's not adequate for any of us for our trials. Here's the failure about. Some people have said up to 40% of all NIH-sponsored trials will never meet our accrual goals. related to site issues. We all overestimate our population, so we're sure that we're picked to do the trial, and a variety of other issues that you can see here. So we really are trying hard to improve all these clinical trials processes. And a lot of it is through the Clinical Translational Science Award program. You have a very strong program here at Colorado. Ron Sokol from Pediatrics is your PI for the CTSA grant. There are 60 of these that are support clinical trial development. I urge you all to take advantage of these services because the program costs $500 million a year at the NIH. It's the single most expensive program in the entire NIH. And we're working on things like single IRB models that are going to be required, master contracts, master protocols with innovative trial designs, shortened consent forms, enhanced human subjects GCP training, performance metrics. So if you're interested in doing a trial, we have 3 trial innovation centers. Those are centers at Hopkins and Tufts, at Vanderbilt and Duke and Utah to provide consultations to you for any of the protocols you're interested in. So I was interested in precision medicine and a genomics approach. I actually got the first stick consult ever done, and my grant was funded on the first try for $8 million. So even seasoned investigators, you take advantage of the services here for statistical analysis, study design, and then you can get national consultations. So the goal for all of us is to actually help you design your trial and conduct your trial and get it funded. And we're hoping that if we can get better protocols, more of these trials will get funded sooner. This is a complicated slide. It was from our CTSA grant. We just got our new 5-year award. We were one of the only centers or the only sites in the country to get a perfect score in our grant. And that's because they loved the services we provided and they loved the emphasis that we had on pediatrics and newborn intensive care. And these are all the clinical research touch points. So on the right are all our groups in the Tufts CTSI that are just there to do one thing and one thing only, support the investigators to conduct their clinical trials. You have probably many of the same infrastructure approaches here, and I would strongly recommend that you take advantage of it. So developing drugs for infants and children, it's really become much more of a national and global effort. No one center has enough children that they can study to meet all the needs that we have. It's really team science, bringing all the key stakeholders together to contribute. A lot of it is around better communication and collaboration, especially with the regulators. So I work very closely with the regulators at FDA, at the European Medicine Agency, at the PMDA in Japan, Health Canada, and we're coordinating all the efforts of all these regulatory agencies to try to help facilitate these clinical trials. Rare diseases are important, and we're going to talk about data, which at the FDA they tell me is now the single most expensive commodity you can buy. It's now more expensive than oil. So as we put this together at the FDA, we called it We Have a Dream. Here's the approach that we'd love to take, that every neonate admitted to the NICU will enroll in a study protocol to optimize outcomes. When I first started training at the Dana-Farber and Boston Children's in the early 80s, most kids died of leukemia. There really wasn't much treatment. So here we are about 30 years later, and 90% of the kids survive. Every parent is happy to put their kids in a research trial because they have cancer. And oh my goodness, they don't want them to die. And yet, in neonates, we're experimenting on them every day because we're just not sure the drugs and the treatment and approaches we're using are safe and effective. The definitions for our most important outcomes will be the same worldwide. So again, what they call hypotension in Europe may be different than what we're talking about it here. We'll collect standardized data on all neonates, and the databases will be shared, harmonized, and readily searchable. And trying to get these databases is really difficult. We can identify them. Trying to put them together is complicated because something as simple as the baby or child, a male or a female. Some places use M and F. Some people use 0 and 1. Some people use 1 and 2. So how do you get all the different variables to say the same thing? That's one of our challenges. We'll be able to easily examine survival and outcome based on the region of the world and adopt best practices. So I would love to hear that in anesthesia for a small sick baby, we have similar approaches, whether in Germany, Europe, Japan, the United States, or Canada. We'll have established normal laboratory values for you. Do you realize we don't know what a normal laboratory value is on a 600 or 700 grammer? We've never established it. We can give you ranges. We know what we'd like to target, but it's not necessarily based on data. All drugs used in neonates will be approved for their use. Sufficient safety and efficacy data exists. So when you put in your NIH grant and you're developing a drug or you're studying a drug, the NIH isn't going to give you a free pass anymore. Part of your grant has to be that you're going to submit those data to the FDA for consideration of a labeling change. And so the NIH and FDA are collaborating much more closely. Drug formulations will be designed for neonates, and any additives will be safe and not affect efficacy. Regulators, investigators, everyone will collaborate to develop the best protocols that are regulatory ready. We have lots of protocols coming through, lots of studies, and then we get them to the FDA and they say, these are really lousy. Or the FDA may push investigators or companies in one direction and we say, but that's not feasible. And they have to go back and change it. So the goal is to try to develop the best protocols up front. High quality and ethical trials conducted in multiple countries simultaneously with well-qualified investigators and sustainable infrastructure, novel therapeutics for neonates, for children, faster, cheaper, and better. So based on a lot of complaining to the FDA, they actually gave us a grant to the Critical Path Institute, and they set up the International Neonatal Consortium. And it concentrates on efforts on those conditions mostly commonly encountered in neonatal intensive care units, the prevention of preterm birth, and you can see some of our priorities on the right, and I won't go into them in detail, except to say that we started with about 4 or 5 members. Now we have over 350 people working in this one consortium. You can see all the partners, so the regulators from FDA, EMA at the top, NIH, we have nursing groups, academic researchers from over 77 institutions worldwide, every major pharmaceutical company, as you can see on the right, and a lot of parent advocacy groups, including the March of Dimes, are all working with us collaboratively. And the goal is when you develop your protocol, we want to be able to get the regulators in Europe, Asia, Canada, and the US all to sign off on the same protocol. And we're actually starting to do that. So when the trial is over, every company, every country will get regulatory approval at the same time. That's our goal. This is a complicated slide, but I just wanted to show you that we set up a really detailed governance program to oversee all these 7 or 8 working groups. We meet at the EMA every fall and the FDA every spring. We get folks involved in a variety of different areas, and we have a variety of different directors and support staff that support the consortium. And these are the projects we're working on. So developing master protocols, we're using neonatal seizures as one approach, trying to standardize definitions and outcomes. Our clinical pharmacology group published a paper on everything you need to know about designing a clinical trial for neonates. It was published about a year ago. Every regulatory agency in the entire world has that paper and is using it as guidance on how to develop trials for neonates. And you can see the other groups that I won't go into just to try to save some time. These are the publications in the last year or two. You can see that, and we have 8 more in press right now. So things are happening very, very quickly in a variety of ways, not only actual talk about outcome measures for clinical trials, but things like looking at shortened consent forms. So the new common rule that is coming out. OHRP will be giving you guidance, but we're hoping now that your consent forms actually will be 2 pages up front, all the key information on your consent forms. Purpose of the study, procedures, the risks and benefits will be in the first 2 pages. Everything else will be in the back of the protocol, of the consent form. And that will be mandated, and you'll be getting guidance on that soon. So, and you can see second from the bottom, we were concerned that there weren't enough babies to enroll in all the trials we needed to conduct. And most companies would say, if you're in one trial, I don't want the baby to be in another trial, even though some of them may have been months apart. So we actually decided to write with several people from the FDA a manuscript on enrolling neonates in more than one clinical trial at a time. And that's now being adopted nationwide as a way of getting infants and children into more than one trial at a time. So again, this is really the way that we've set things up, that with a consortium, much like yours for anesthesia, leverage insights with academia, government, industry, get all the key stakeholders to the table, and then talk about endpoints, IT delivery systems, basic science, modeling, simulation. The FDA is allowing a lot of studies now with what we call extrapolation, so that if you have adult data, I may be able to adapt your adult data to the neonates or children without having to do any trials at all. So this is really important, but clearly all of us are looking to impact patients with better dosing, more appropriate use of current drugs, and increased access to new drugs. Now, one of the other exciting venues and avenues that we've taken is we've actually set up a brand new nonprofit global pharmaceutical and device company called the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children. And it is one of the most exciting endeavors I've ever been involved with. And basically, it's there and it's been started. It was started with a $5 million grant from the FDA, and now the pharmaceutical industry is buying into this, because this will be a place, instead of them working at pharma or at a company to develop a trial, it's really important that they'll go to IACT, that's what we call it for short, and they will help you develop your trial. So if you have a neonatal trial, they'll get a number of neonatologists that have expertise to work with you, and will put your trial together for you, set up your sites, and have it as one-stop shopping to try to accelerate the process. So strategy and planning, tools, best practices, training, investigators, infrastructure and trials execution, and leadership. So these are all factors that this new company is really focusing on, and I'll talk to you more about it if we have some time during the questions. What they're doing is they're giving out memberships, so some of the pharmaceutical companies like Novartis and others are investing in it in order to set this company up, because they recognize they have to do the trials, and so it's important also to have the infrastructure set up. And the IACT for Children, it's a global vision. So it's really important for people to understand that this is interoperable, global, sustainable infrastructure for pediatric clinical trials of innovative medicines and devices. And so we're right now in the stages of plans and protocols, feasibility, identifying sites, and signing them up. So once we sign your site up, and I serve as the chair of their scientific advisory board. So I'm not working with the companies directly, because I can't, because it would create a conflict with me at the FDA. But there will be investigators that will work with the companies to set their protocols up. And then when the sites get set up, that site will stay set up for good. It's not going to be that when the grant is over or the study is over, that's going to disappear. When that study's over, the next one will start the next week, and you'll have everything already, and you'll keep going one study to the next. So this is what we're hoping for. And what we're also hoping for is the way it's going to work is interacting with a variety of other sites. There's the innovative medicine approach initiative, IMI2, the second one in Europe. And this is what the pediatric clinical trials ecosystem as we call it. We want all these different networks to be collaborating and working together. There just isn't enough children and there isn't enough neonates in order for us to do all the studies that we need to do. And we can't just have multi-site randomized clinical trials for every single drug we test. There's just not enough time and there's just not enough patients. So you can see here a variety of different groups, but I do want you to see the CTSA towards the bottom on the left. That is really, we're setting that up as one of the best clinical trials networks that has ever been developed. And there's also a new network in Europe. It's called the Connect for Children Network, which is, again, collaborating with other existing networks as we bring all the key players together to try to really facilitate this process and develop new drugs for infants and children. So to end, and I tried to zip through to save a little bit of time for questions, from one of my favorite movies, of course, The Wizard of Oz. We're really going to need sustainable infrastructure. We can't have sites that open and close on a regular basis, so that you hire your study coordinators, and then when the study closes, you're trying to figure out how you're going to pay for them. More and more, the companies are paying you per patient. So you have to run enough trials and be enrolling enough patients to even pay for personnel. So how do we get around that? So IACT, for instance, is interested in paying for study coordinators up front for you to focus on all of their trials and then also use those people for other trials as well. And what's really important for the companies is what we do is we say, we've passed this legislation now mandating you to have to conduct these clinical trials. And then when they come to your site or my site, we say, well, you know, we have a problem. If we do your trial, it's not really going to help my junior investigator. They're not going to get their name probably published on the paper. The dean wants, you know, in order to get promoted, you have to write NIH grants and get funding. So we've been mandating that these companies do these trials with legislation, and then many of the academic centers say they're too busy to conduct the trials. So that's one of our major challenges. So sustainable infrastructure, working with the companies, working with NIH and other funders is critically important. We have to have cooperative networks that collaborate together. We have to have a knowledgeable workforce. So at my institution, we're running 10 clinical trials now in the NICU. I usually assign a junior investigator to every clinical trial. So part of their salary is covered, and also they get experience on what it means to conduct a clinical trial. And the people there know that I'm going to help oversee it. So if there's any issues, I'm going to be involved because I don't want them to fail. But that's one way of helping to train the workforce. And we're going to have efficient regulatory processes. So getting the regulators on board has been really, really important. We've screamed and yelled at them for a long time. They're opening up. They're getting things accomplished. So we're excited about that. And that's the only way we're going to really make a significant impact on maternal child health. So I think I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions. Thanks so much. Please.
Thank you for talking to the overview. Great. Can you explain, so a lot of people are talking about something like pragmatic trials.
Mm-hmm.
How does that, how does the data you get from that translate to the guidance, and will the FDA accept those labeling?
Yeah, everything's up in the air. But I think, you know, what I've encouraged people to do is to talk to the FDA as they're designing their protocols. So you can call for what's called a Type C meeting. Companies can do it, but so can investigators. So, for instance, I had a group of investigators from Canada, the US, and Germany call me and say, we have a protocol with mesenchymal stem cells that we want to put into the lungs of newborn infants preemies to try to protect their lungs. And how do we design those trials? So I encourage them to actually go sit with people from the pulmonary branch of the FDA to try to talk to them and say, okay, how do we make this work? What are the outcome measures we should be focusing on? How should we design the trial? And get feedback from them. And then a lot of those folks are getting feedback from us and from the consortium through the papers that we're publishing. So you're right, we want a variety of different data sources, and data are king right now. They really are. And the FDA is paying attention to those data when they get them and looking at them, and even data that's being generated in Europe. I mean, in the past, they would never pay attention to that. And now, even the CuraSurf and surfactant that many of us are using in our NICUs is from Italy, and it was approved without a tremendous amount of U.S. data. So that was one of the first drugs, at least in neonates. So that's a good thing. But you are correct. There's a lot of work to do, and they are being much more flexible. Now, with that being said, you know, as we sit on top of things and want each of the divisions to operate in the same way, you know, you have a lot of insular groups at FDA that we're trying to make an impact on. And getting them to talk to us and interact is a really big deal. Each of these consortium working groups have at least 2 or 3 people from that group at FDA. So that's made a huge difference when they say, well, I wouldn't accept that, but I would accept this. So for a company hearing that as an outcome measure, they've just saved 2 years. Because if they designed a protocol and the FDA doesn't accept their outcome measures, they got to go back to the drawing board. So we're hoping to really facilitate all these processes.
At the end of your talk, you talked about the fact that academic institutions have a problem with investigators don't get promoted. I think there's another problem that's even a bigger problem, and that is common and happens every day. And that when an investigator works with a company, they become painful.
Right.
That anything, I mean, as honest as they can be, there's always, it's not just a disclaimer as you kind of put in your own talk. The fact is many people won't believe the research because it was funded by the company. And in fact, you could just see this happen at Cornell with this very famous dean who's now a target of all kinds of investigations because, in fact, his research with companies is somehow poison. And he is poison, even though his research is absolutely okay. There needs to be some kind of, like they do in law firms with the Chinese firewall, where the company puts the money in and goes to the institution, but the investigator isn't tainted by doing that research.
Right.
The current way it's set up, as soon as you are involved in a trial of any drug, any population that's funded by a company, you're no longer considered honest, which is just insane because who else is going to do this research?
Right. So you are correct. I mean, look, some people look at industry as something evil because they're there to make profits. And when I go to Congress, and I spend a lot more time there now, there are some people who really believe that and don't want to give them any additional breaks or things like that. They're making too much money. They're taking advantage of us. Yet, to be realistic, most of the drugs we're using are being made by somebody, and we can't make them. And we can't distribute them, and we can't afford to test every drug. And so we have to recognize, and you're 100% right, that we need industry as much as they need us. And so we have to figure out a way of doing this in a way that makes sense. And with our consortia, we have senior VPs from, I showed you the companies, almost every major pharmaceutical company. We sit in the room with them. It's okay as long as we don't talk about specific products or drug development programs. But if we talk in general about outcome measures, clinical trial designs, all the elements that are essential, and that's fine with the FDA, as long as we don't get too close to that. But I agree with you. I went to a national meeting one time, and they had a investigators workshop or something, and I went, and we had a lunch served. And at the end of the year, I went on that website, I forget which one of the senators, put this website out, but I found my name under Pfizer, having donated $28 to me, had paid me $28. And I didn't even know they were funding it. But you do have to be aware of it. And you're correct that when you're involved in a clinical trial, your name's published on the website, and that is difficult for some investigators. And yet, I think we all have to recognize that it's a symbiotic relationship, that if we don't get them engaged and help them conduct the trials, how do we expect to improve the outcome for our patients? Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate all your time.